As Vesey, Nat Turner, and other slaves in the South continued to carry out their rebellions and show that they were willing to resist this evil institution of slavery, the abolitionists, who lived primarily in the North, were inspired to continue their efforts to abolish and end slavery. And it is that effort and that campaign that we are going to focus on in this class. We are going to talk about some of the earliest efforts to end slavery and do so in a way that will have the least detrimental effect on the slave owners, and also in a more conservative manner to ensure that these freed slaves, should they be freed, will not stay in America, but rather go back to Africa. So we're going to be talking about efforts early on in self-help. We're going to talk about colonizing societies. And then finally, we're going to move up until the 1830s and 1840s, when abolitionism takes a new approach, a more radical approach, led by people like William Lloyd Garrison. And finally, we'll finish up today's lecture by talking about one of the most concerted, systematic efforts to free slaves, and that, of course, was the Underground Railroad. We're going to begin this history and story of abolitionism in the 1790s, because in that decade, we see African Americans in the North encouraging social uplift as a means for free blacks to gain equality. Thus, these African American leaders spoke of the need for African Americans to educate themselves, abstain from drinking, and work hard. Doing these things, these self-help proponents would argue, allowed blacks to gain, quote, respectability and thus become the social equals of whites. As a result, in the major cities of the Northeast, including Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, African American leaders opened up churches, schools, and self-help associations. Despite putting the emphasis on African Americans to improve their own conditions, whites reacted with violence. Most notably, over 2 weeks in August 1829 in Cincinnati, Ohio, 200 to 300 whites, many of them Irish immigrants, went to the predominantly African American riverfront district to scare the blacks out of the city. African Americans made up about 10% of Cincinnati's population, and therefore they would consistently compete with the poor white immigrants, including the Irish, for jobs. Therefore, the whites burned shelters and homes and attacked African Americans, forcing them to flee, including some permanently, to Canada. So here we see, even in the North, despite not being enslaved, there are stark differences between the whites and blacks, and this will lead to, again, this use of violence, even as African Americans are touting this idea of self-help. Just work hard enough and white America will accept you. Well, as we see in Cincinnati, that's not the case. So therefore, the question starts to arise. If we're already seeing problems with free African Americans, what does that mean for the likely success of abolishing slavery and then having all these freed slaves living in America? Well, others during this time began to argue that whites would never accept African Americans as equals, and therefore they would never be allowed to integrate into white society. If integration into white society is not possible, what would be the best approach? Well, this is when we have a guy by the name of Reverend Robert Finley stepping onto the scene with the founding of the American Colonization Society in 1817. This plan involved paying slaveholders who voluntarily freed their slaves. So this is, again, not a complete end to slavery, but rather payment to slave owners to actually free their slaves. Looking at the situation from an economic standpoint, Reverend Finley argued that African Americans would be considered a threat to the economic well-being of whites as they competed for them with jobs. And this is in fact what happened more than a decade after the founding of the American Colonization Society in Cincinnati, as we just talked about. Others worried that African Americans would mix too freely with whites in social circumstances. So therefore, due to these economic and social concerns, this organization, the American Colonization Society, would eventually help the United States establish the colony of Liberia. And in that colony of Liberia, about 12,000 freed blacks were eventually sent. But in the end, a lack of funds to purchase the freedom of slaves prevented this number from being any larger than the 12,000 who arrived there. Many critics, in fact, charge that the colonization societies actually encouraged the continuation of slavery by making it less widespread and therefore less noticeable to the general population, who would therefore have an easier time ignoring this evil institution. The same year that Cincinnati erupted in riots, David Walker published his appeal. This is what you're going to read a selection from in today's class. David Walker was an African American critic of the colonization movement, and he urged black resistance to slavery. He listed the many political and civil rights denied to freed blacks and spoke out forcefully against efforts to dehumanize African Americans. For Walker, black liberation required education for African Americans, especially knowledge about their oppression at the hands of whites. Walker, who used a used clothing store that he owned in Boston, actually smuggled his anti-slavery tracts into the South, his anti-slavery writings into the South, by stuffing them in the pockets of clothing that he sold to slave owners who used it to clothe their slaves. Walker would eventually join other African American activists in 1830 for a national convention in Philadelphia. During this convention, the delegates would actually reject both Walker's call for rebellion and the self-help programs of earlier abolitionists. Therefore, as we reached the 1830s, the question became, what is the best approach to arrive at a conclusion to the slavery problem? Walker was one of the many black critics of colonization during this time, but there were others besides him, and these others put forth a different approach to colonization, and this was immediate abolition. And what we will see is that a group of African Americans in New Bedford, Massachusetts, argued against colonization by saying the following: that colonization, quote, looks upon us, meaning African Americans, as unnaturally legal residents in the country, and thus by force of prejudice, if not by law, endeavor to compel us to embark for Africa. In short, these critics considered the American Colonization Society both racist and pro-slavery. As an alternative, these critics turned to immediate abolition of slavery as the necessary goal. Up until 1833, black conventions were the only national anti-slavery gatherings, but this would soon change as a white activist, abolitionist from northeastern United States entered the scene and became one of the leading voices of immediate abolition. That individual is the man that we see on the right hand of the screen, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison became a leader in the interracial, meaning white and black, abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison was the child of indentured servants. He was actually born in Massachusetts in 1805. He was an editor of an abolitionist newspaper in Baltimore, and during this time, Garrison went to jail in 1830, convicted of libeling a New England merchant who took part in the domestic slave trade. The following year, in 1831, Garrison published the first issue of The Liberator, which would stay in print until 1865, serving as the leading abolitionist periodical in the United States. During its first year, 450 of the 500 subscribers to The Liberator were African American, showing again the interracial nature of this abolitionism of the 1830s. Moreover, as William Lloyd Garrison explained, the liberator belonged, in his words, emphatically to the people of color. It is their organ. So this is a willing embrace by this white man from the Northeast United States who was willing to use his magazine, his periodical, as a vehicle for the voice of African Americans in the abolitionist cause. Beyond his periodical, Garrison was also involved in the creation of a new organization. On January 1, 1832, Garrison helped found the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison, as part of this group, would help bring it up to 2,000 members strong within 2 years. So now that we have his writings and his organizational role out of the way, I want to talk about Garrison's perspective vis-a-vis slavery and abolition. Through the Liberator and through the New England Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison relied on moral suasion, or more simply put, persuasion using moral arguments to turn public opinion against slavery and racism. For him, the most important abolitionist work was the conversion of white Americans to make them more accepting of black equality. To this end, in 1833, Garrison and more than 60 abolitionists formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. They based their opposition to slavery on equality, which they believed could be found in both the Declaration of Independence as well as the laws of man found in the Bible. Its membership, the membership of the American Anti-Slavery Society, included African Americans, but it forbid women of both races from joining. The organization's Declaration of Sentiments, which were written by Garrison, called for, quote, and this is what we see on the screen, called for, quote, immediate and general emancipation, as well as equal rights for all persons of color. This is, again, a far cry, and obviously a far cry from what we saw at the American Colonization Society, where we see William Lloyd Garrison calling for immediate emancipation. None of this paying the slave owners to free their slaves, demand that it be done. And secondly, not only that, not ship them off to Africa, but insist that they live and stay in America. And not only that, but one step further, ensure equality, social equality between whites and blacks. At the same time, Garrison would continue to rely on moral suasion to alter the consciences of slaveholders to abandon slavery and persuade Congress to act in constitutionally permissive ways to end slavery in the District of Columbia, to outlaw the slave trade and also not admit any new slave states. So in short, what I'm arguing here is essentially Garrison has radical goals, but he wants to use conservative tactics. So again, immediate emancipation, social equality, but he wants to do this not through force, but rather through moral suasion, to convince the slaveholders themselves that what they're doing is wrong, and also to convince Congress that it should work within the Constitution, what is allowed through the Constitution, to end slavery in the District of Columbia, to outlaw the slave trade, and to not admit any new slave trade. This would change within a decade of failure, essentially. Seeing that moral suasion is no longer working, we would see by the 1840s, Garrison began to advocate disunion. As we can see in this quote on the screen, he said the following: "A repeal of the union between Northern liberty and Southern slavery is essential to the abolition of one and preservation of the other." So what we are seeing here is he is essentially saying the union cannot exist if we intend to secure and preserve liberty. The union between the free North and the slave South will not allow for the existence of liberty. So therefore, we must disunite. Disunion is the only way to achieve the goals that Garrison wanted. In short, he believed that the political system was corrupt, and therefore no solution could be offered by it to end slavery. Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society would play a leading role in creating and running the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad grew in response to the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, which held that northern states were required by law to aid in the capture of runaway slaves. Between 1830 and 1860, at least 150,000 slaves escaped bondage using the Underground Railroad, and these included such well-known former slaves as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. White and free blacks living in the South often helped runaway slaves escape to safety in the North and gave them food and clothing. And in fact, what we're going to see is an entire system using terminology of a railroad to explain this process. So first of all, the actual process involved a conductor. The conductor usually would pose as a slave and then enter these southern plantations. Harriet Tubman was one of the most famous conductors. Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland in 1822 and escaped in 1849. During the next decade, in the 1850s, Tubman made at least 13 trips back to Maryland from the South, helping free approximately 70 slaves, including some of her own family members. The conductors like Harriet Tubman, would then, once they figured their way into the plantations, would then lead the slaves out at night and travel between 10 and 20 miles to the next station, as they were known. And these stations were the homes and businesses that housed runaway slaves. While many of these slaves did run through forests and swamps to escape their captors, just as many escaped by horse and carriage, by boarding ships, or railroad cars destined for the North. So what we are seeing here is what we're looking at visually on the right. We're seeing these various stops along the way of the Underground Railroad from the south to the north. And this is a long process. And a lot of them would go through various main sites in the Northeast, including Philadelphia, New York. But we also see some, lesser known, going to Cuba, some also going to Mexico. But regardless of their destination, this was a huge success. But at the end of the day, despite the huge success, 150,000, far greater than the 12,000 freed slaves that were sent over to Liberia, it's still a drop in the bucket. Compared to the high numbers of slaves in the South, 150,000 is nothing. As I alluded to while looking at that map, New York, among other cities in the Northeast, would play pivotal roles in the slave trade, the Underground Railroad. And what I want to do is I want to look at the origins of these runaways. And to do that, we're going to look at the records of Howard Gay. Howard Gay was an abolitionist and key player in the Underground Railroad in New York. And what he did was he kept records of all the people who were brought to his station in New York City as they were making their way north, sometimes just to northern New York State, but other times all the way up to Canada. Now, most of these slaves that arrived at Howard Gay's station in New York City were in their 20s, meaning they were in their prime working years. So they were highly valuable to their owners. So this was a very dangerous process because their owners were going to come out looking for them. And according to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, they were required to return them. Well, 3/4 of the adult fugitives were also men. And as you can see, these came from all of the southern states. But one thing that I want to point out is we see the highest numbers coming from the Upper South. Maryland, 94. Virginia, 66. North Carolina, 19. Delaware, 11. District of Columbia, 10. Compare that to Georgia, South Carolina, just 2 in the mid-1850s. But nonetheless, again, these northern stations would play a key role bringing some of these valuable slaves to freedom in the North. I mentioned the many ways that these slaves would escape, but I want to do a little sidebar here, just to show the novelty of some of these tactics used by people striving for freedom. One of the famous examples of a unique approach taken by a slave was that of a slave from Virginia, the guy that we see on the right, Henry Box Brown. Henry Box Brown, as his name implies, packed himself in a box, which was then placed on a railroad car headed towards Philadelphia, thus beginning his nearly 30-hour trek to freedom. So this was one of the most interesting examples of the escape here. As you can see, Henry Box Brown later telling his story, "I felt my eyes swelling, as if they would burst from their sockets, and the veins on my temples were dreadfully distended with pressure of blood upon my head. In this position I attempted to lift my hand to my face, but I had no power to move it. I felt a cold sweat coming over me, which seemed to be a warning that death was about to terminate my earthly miseries." What he is speaking about is the fact that the people who put him on this train accidentally put his box upside down. So not only was he sitting upside down for this 30-hour trek, but also the air holes in the top of that box were now restricted. So this was a very dangerous endeavor, but it shows you the length that people will go to get out of slavery, which was obviously far worse. So in general, this Underground Railroad, although it was secretive, it was, particularly in the North, a well-known activity, often discussed in the daily newspapers. That did not make it any less dangerous, however, for individuals caught assisting any of these runaway slaves. One abolitionist, a guy by the name of Charles T. Torrey, a minister, died while in Maryland State Penitentiary. Another man, Thomas Garrett, had to pay a fine after being sued by the owner of the runaway slaves that he assisted. Yet for the most part, Northern officials looked the other way. That is at least until 1850, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, as we'll talk about in another class in the upcoming lectures.